Hello and welcome. I'm LJ, and in this video I'm going to be looking at the 10 plagues of Egypt and why did God kill the firstborns of Egypt. Now, why did God kill all the firstborn children in Egypt? Why didn't God just kill Pharaoh instead? What about the innocent children and their innocent parents that were murdered by God during the plague? These are all questions that are often directed at the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, often used to discredit the God of the Bible and show him to be a murderer of children and the innocent. Now, how can we reconcile a God who claims to be love with a God that administers punishment through the death of innocent people and children? We cannot simply hide from the story or deny it. It is there for everyone to see, clearly depicted in the Bible. In this video, we should tackle the issues head on and see if we can answer why God killed the firstborns of Egypt. Firstly, it needs to be stated for everyone that isn't aware of the story that this was actually plague number 10 of 10. It was the last plague that God sent to Egypt. There had been 9 previous plagues issued by God into Egypt before we even get to the deaths of the firstborns. So now, not only do we have to deal with and answer why plague 10, but also the other 9 plagues that were sent as well. Although we should point out that they were much less severe. Actually, we will see that they are in God's defence rather than a further strike at God's morality. The statement that God kills the innocent also begs the question that the Egyptians were in fact innocent, which we shall see is a long way from the truth. In order to give a full and concise answer as to what led God to such an act, then we need to go back a long way before the event in question. All the way back to the book of Genesis, in fact, where we find the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Israel. He was sold by his brothers into slavery as they were jealous of him, as Israel, their father, loved Joseph the most. Joseph was taken to Egypt. He was put in prison in Egypt when the Pharaoh at the time had a vision. Joseph managed to interpret this vision and told of a coming famine. Pharaoh, as a reward, made him second in charge of the whole of Egypt. Now, when this famine came, some of the sons of Israel went down into Egypt to buy some food, as Egypt was the only place that had stored food, having been aware of the famine through Pharaoh and Joseph. Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, and eventually Israel and the rest of his sons moved to Egypt to be with Joseph, and there were about 70 people in total. So we have had a quick overview as to why Israel was in Egypt in the first place. Now, it came to pass that both the Pharaoh and Joseph died, and a new Pharaoh came to power. But this Pharaoh did not know Joseph and his relationship with the Pharaoh of Joseph's time. He saw that Joseph's family, the Hebrews, had multiplied greatly and in fact now outnumbered the Egyptians themselves. Exodus 1:8. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it came to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and they fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the Pharaoh had put the children of Israel, the Hebrew people, to work. They were no longer simply living in Egypt, they were now put to work for the Pharaoh. Looking at the text in more detail, we see that the Pharaoh was actually embarking on a course of population control. He had noted that the Hebrew people outnumbered the Egyptians and he wanted to stop them multiplying. How does he go about doing this? He invokes an order for taskmasters to be put over them. So the way in which Pharaoh was trying to implement this population control was by working them to death. This obviously was an abhorrent action and would have been a rather unpleasant way of dying. Literally worked not to the point where you were physically unable to do any more, but to the point that you actually died. But this action didn't work. The Hebrews continued to grow in numbers. So the Pharaoh made them slaves. Exodus 1:12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigour. And they made their lives bitter with the hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigour. They had gone from living in the land to serving it, and then into slavery. So now they wouldn't just be worked to death, but also they would now be officially slaves and thus would have been treated as such. But the Pharaoh didn't stop there. Observing the population was still growing, despite his attempts to reduce it, he embarked on a program of exterminating all Hebrew male newborns, basically engaging in a cull of the Hebrew people. He ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill any newborn baby boys from the Hebrew people. Exodus 1:15. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of the midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Now the midwives didn't do as they were commanded, as they feared God. Exodus 1:17. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men and children alive. Pharaoh, after finding out the midwives were not carrying out his command, charged the people of Egypt to kill the baby boys instead, ordering that they should be cast into the river and drowned. Exodus 1:22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. So the children of Israel were now enslaved and also facing Pharaoh's program of murdering every newborn male child of the people of Israel. This was not an order to kill the firstborn children, but all male children. This is a pogrom of 50% of the newborn Hebrews. This is a merciless act, done with the sole intention of reducing the population of the Hebrews. Now, approximately 35 to 40 years after the people of Israel were enslaved, Moses was born. His mother had to hide him before he was rescued by Pharaoh's own daughter. Exodus 2:1. And there went a man out of the house of Levi and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river bank. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrew children. Then said the sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. The fact that Moses had to be hidden, otherwise he would have been killed, highlights the fact that this program of killing the Hebrew children had not stopped. So this decree had been going strong for nearly 40 years. Moses grew up, and at the age of 40, after killing an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite, he fled Egypt and went into exile. We are then told of the death of the Pharaoh who had inflicted the slavery and the infanticide. Exodus 2:23. And it came to pass, in process of time, that the king of Egypt died. And the children of Israel sighed by reason of their bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. At the age of 80, God called Moses to go and free his people. Exodus 3:9. Therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So Moses goes to the new Pharaoh and tells him that the God of Israel has asked that he let his people go. Exodus 5:1. And afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. He is also told what the ultimate consequences of not letting the Hebrew people go. Moses was told to tell Pharaoh that if he didn't let the Hebrew people go, then it would result in the death of all the firstborns in Egypt. This was before any miracle had been shown, before any plague had come to Egypt. Pharaoh was given ample chance to do as he was requested. Exodus 4:22. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. But Pharaoh, who worshipped the gods of Egypt, did not worship the God of Israel, so refused. This God was not a God that he was going to listen to. And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. The Pharaoh not only refused to hearken to the request to let the Hebrew people go, he increased the hardship of work upon them. Exodus 4:5. And Pharaoh said, Behold, the people of the land are now many, and make them rest from their burdens. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, Ye shall no more give the people straw to make brick, as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and the tail of the bricks, which they did make heretofore, ye shall lay upon them. Ye shall not diminish out thereof, for they be idle. Therefore they cry, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let there more work be laid upon the men, that they may labour therein, and let them not regard vain words. So we see that there was a new Pharaoh in charge, but the enslavement of the Hebrew people had not stopped with the death of the old Pharaoh. The new Pharaoh had risen to power and continued what his predecessor had begun. And this is why the killing of Pharaoh himself would have served to be a pointless and ineffective means to free the Hebrews from slavery. Had God killed the Pharaoh, then another would simply have arisen in his place, and the slavery would have continued as has been shown. The people of Egypt would have continued on in their ways, worshipping their gods, and the enslavement of the Hebrew people would have gone on. It serves to show that this wasn't now just one man's oppression of the Hebrews. This was now what the Egyptian people had accepted as part of their way of life. The Hebrews were now just slaves in the nation of Egypt. There is also no mention of the killing of the firstborns having ceased. This now approximately 120 years after it was first initiated. It is reasonable to assume that not all of the male newborns were in fact killed, as otherwise there wouldn't have been any new Hebrews left at this point. But as we have nothing to say that it had stopped, this assumption is still valid, even if the effectiveness, or at least the rate of execution, wasn't at 100%. Now, just before the plagues started, Moses met with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked for a miracle. Moses showed him the staff that turned into a serpent. Serpents in ancient time represented deity. Moses throwing down the staff and it turning into a serpent would have been a sign that God was with him. Pharaoh's sorcerers were able to copy this, and they also made serpents from their staffs, showing that they also had gods with them. Now, the serpents of the sorcerers, though, were swallowed up by the serpent of Moses, a clear indication that the God of Moses was indeed a more powerful God, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. Exodus 7:8. And the Lord spake unto Moses, and said unto Aaron, saying, When Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, Show a miracle for you, then thou shalt say unto Aaron, Take thy rod, and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh, and before his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did like manner with their enchantments. For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods, and he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And thus ensued a battle between God and the gods of Egypt. Each plague sent by God is a direct attack on the gods of Egypt, to prove that they were in fact powerless against him, and that he will always triumph over worldly gods. Moses is sent back to Pharaoh to warn him of the impending first plague, of which I shall go through and explain which gods God is attacking, as I will with each plague. We must remember that God has already asked on numerous occasions that Pharaoh has refused on each occasion. His people copied the miracle of the Moses staff into a serpent, and Pharaoh refused to acknowledge the God of Israel. This again is after he had been warned of the ultimate consequences of his refusal. Now, rather than administrating the judgment that he promised he would indeed minister, God instead gives Pharaoh 9 further opportunities to change his mind and let the Hebrews go. And this would be 9 opportunities for the people of Egypt to see the power of God and to follow him. So God begins with the 10 plagues of Egypt. So we start with the first plague, water to blood. Now, before the administration of the plague, God tells Moses to inform Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go, and also what would happen if he refused. Exodus 7:16. And thou shalt say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me unto thee, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, hereto thou wouldest not hear. Thus saith the Lord, In this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in mine hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river. And Moses then administers the plague as God has told him. Exodus 7:20. And Moses and Aaron did so, and the Lord commanded, and he lifted up this rod and smote the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood, and the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. So what was the purpose of the plague? Why did God choose this particular wonder? Well, as we will see with all the plagues, they were the judgments against the gods of Egypt, the ones that Pharaoh himself would have worshipped. God was showing that they were powerless and that God was the true God. The first plague was to demonstrate the lack of power of Hapi, the Egyptian god of the Nile. Exodus 7:24. And all the Egyptians digged around the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river, and 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. The Egyptians were unable to drink from the water for 7 days, showing Hapi's inability to restore the water. The second plague, frogs. Exodus 8:1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all the borders with frogs, and the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and unto thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon the people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come upon both on thee, and upon thy people, and upon thy servants. Again, Moses is told to ask the Pharaoh to let the people go, and warn of the judgment that would happen if he didn't. Exodus 8:6. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up, and covered the land of Egypt, and the magicians did so with their enchantments, and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. So the second plague was administered. This was an attack on Heket, the Egyptian goddess of fertility, who was depicted with a frog's head. And this plague, after this plague, Pharaoh said that he would do as requested and release the Hebrews. Exodus 8:8. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and said, Entreat the Lord, that he may take away the frogs from me, and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord. Then he repented again, and refused to let the people leave after the frogs were removed. Exodus 8:12. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the words of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart, and hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. So, plague 3, gnats or lice. Exodus 8:16. And the Lord said unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch out thy rod, and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in men and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt, and the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice. But they could not. So there was lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magicians said unto Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. This plague was aimed at the god of the earth, Geb, the lice coming from the dust of the earth. Now, interestingly, at this point, the Egyptian sorcerers were unable to replicate the feat, and admitted that this was, in fact, God. This would clearly have demonstrated the power of God and exposed the lack of it from the Egyptian gods. But Pharaoh was undeterred. The fourth plague was flies. And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, Behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses, and into the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. So Pharaoh was again warned about the judgment, and then the judgment was carried out. Exodus 8:24. And the Lord did so, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the houses of Pharaoh, and into their servants' houses, and into the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. This plague was against Khepri, the god of creation, movement of the sun, and rebirth. He had the head of a fly. Pharaoh once more stated his intention to let the Hebrews go. Exodus 8:28. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only ye shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. Before he then changed his mind after the plague had been subsided. Exodus 8:30. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. So we have plague number 5, livestock. Pharaoh is once again warned before the execution of this plague. Exodus 9:1. Then the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, and tell him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if thou refuse to let them go, and withhold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle, which is in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, and upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. The plague is then administered in Exodus 9:6. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Now this plague was an attack on Hathor, the goddess of love and protection, who was depicted with a cow's head. And so we have plague number 6, which was boils. Exodus 9:8. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, Take to ye handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it towards the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the land of Egypt. And they took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up towards heaven. And it became a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. And the boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. Then God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he refused to let them leave. Exodus 9:12. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had spoken unto Moses. Now this was an attack on Isis, the goddess of medicine and peace. 7th plague was hail. Exodus 9:13. And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let mine people go, that they may serve me. For I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. For now I will stretch out my hand, that I may smite thee and thy people with pestilence, and thou shalt be cut off from the earth. And once more Pharaoh is warned of the consequences of not releasing the Hebrews from bondage. Now we see that God even tells Pharaoh to remove his cattle from the field to save them. In Exodus 9:18, Behold, tomorrow for this time I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as hath not been in Egypt since the foundation thereof, even until now. Send therefore now, and gather thy cattle, and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hell shall come down upon them, and they shall die. At this point, we are told that there were Egyptians that were in fear of God. They had clearly seen what he had done in previous plagues and were now following his instructions in Exodus 9:20. He that feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. But there are obviously people who didn't take any notice. Exodus 9:21. And he that regarded not the word of the Lord left his servants and his cattle in the field. After the plague came, Pharaoh called Moses and admitted his sin and his wickedness. Exodus 9:27. And Pharaoh sent and called for Moses and Aaron and said unto them, I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. And Pharaoh told Moses to talk to his God and tell him that he would now release the Hebrew people. Exodus 9:28. Entreat the Lord, for it is enough that there be no more mighty thunderings and hail, and I will let you go, and ye shall stay no longer. This now was being the third time that Pharaoh had stated his intention to release the Hebrews. But even so, he again recanted once the plague was stayed. Exodus 9:33. And Moses went out from the city from Pharaoh, and spread abroad his hands unto the Lord. And the thunders and hail ceased, and the rain was not poured upon the earth. And when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunders were ceased, he sinned yet more, and hardened his heart, he and his servants. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, neither would he let the children of Israel go, as the Lord had spoken by Moses. Then we come to plague number 8, the locusts. And Pharaoh was yet again warned before the administration of this plague. Exodus 10:3. And Moses and Aaron came in unto Pharaoh and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, How long wilt thou refuse to humble thyself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring the locusts into thy coast, and they shall cover the face of the earth, that one cannot be able to see the earth. And they shall eat the residue of which is escaped, which remaineth unto you from the hell, and shall eat every tree which groweth for you out of the field. And they shall fill thy houses, and the houses of all thy servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians, which neither thy fathers nor thy fathers' fathers have seen, since the day that they were upon the earth unto this day. And he turned himself and went out from Pharaoh. Now the servants of Pharaoh asked Pharaoh to let the Hebrew people go, fearing that if they were not, Egypt would be destroyed. Exodus 10:7. And Pharaoh's servant said unto him, How long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? After the plague had come, Pharaoh once again called to Moses, saying he had sinned against the God of the Hebrews, and that he would now let the people go. Exodus 10:16. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, I have sinned against the Lord your God, and against you. Now therefore forgive, I pray thee, my sin only this once, and entreat the Lord your God, that he may take away from me this death only. And he went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord turned a mighty strong west wind, which took away the locusts, and cast them into the Red Sea. There remained not one locust in all the coast of Egypt. But, as before, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not let the people go. Exodus 10:20. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go. Now, plague 8 was an attack on Serapia, the very god who was meant to defend Egypt against locusts. God rendered this God utterly ineffective to prevent the God of the Hebrews. Then came the penultimate plague, the last plague before the firstborns would be killed, darkness. Exodus 10:21. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thine hand towards heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched out forth his hand towards heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So there was darkness over the land of Egypt for 3 full days. This plague was to demonstrate the lack of power against the god Ra and Osiris and Horus, all of which were gods related to the sun. Pharaoh was yet again willing to let the people go, but he didn't want them to take their cattle in flocks. Exodus 10:24. And Pharaoh called unto Moses and said, Go ye, serve the Lord, only let your flocks and herds be stayed. Let your little ones also go with you. Clearly, the Pharaoh wanted some guarantee that the Hebrews would return after they went to worship their God. He expected them to return and continue on as slaves. He wasn't willing to let them go completely, just allow them to go and worship for a period of time. But this wasn't acceptable to Moses, who wasn't willing that the Hebrew people should return to Egypt and return to slavery. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to let the people go at all, and this time even threatened Moses with death if he came before him again. Exodus 10:27. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let him go. And Pharaoh said unto him, Get thee away from me, take heed to thyself, see my face no more, for in that day that thou seest my face thou shalt die. And Moses said, Thou hast spoken well, I will see thy face no more. Now, before Moses left his council with Pharaoh, God told Moses to warn of the coming judgment, of the last plague, the death of the firstborns. The judgment which had already been warned of before any of the plagues of Egypt had happened. Exodus 11:4. And Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, About midnight I will go into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And there shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue, against man or beast, that ye may know that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. Now Moses told of the 10th plague that was to come approximately 2 weeks before the event itself took place. We have seen that there were Egyptians who were listening to Moses and followed what he said by this time, and they were obviously convinced that that God was the actual true God and more powerful than the gods that they had been worshipping. We have more evidence of this in Exodus 11:2. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbour, and every woman of her neighbour, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. And the Lord gave the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So Moses spoke to the people, warning them of the last plague that would befall Egypt. But Pharaoh's heart was again hardened, so that he would not let the people go. Exodus 11:9. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land. And Pharaoh Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of the land. The plague of the death of the firstborns was a direct attack on Pharaoh himself, seeing how Pharaoh himself was thought of as a deity in human form. This was to demonstrate Pharaoh's inability to keep not only his own people safe from harm, but his weakness to protect even his own family. Moses had told the people how to be spared of the coming judgment in Exodus 12:7. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on 2 side posts and on the upper door post of the houses wherein they shall eat it. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. The Hebrew God was offering to protect anyone that believed in him. Anyone that put their faith in the Egyptian gods for protection would be faced with the consequences of that misplaced faith. So the time of execution of the plague was at hand. God clearly states his intention that his judgment would be against the gods of Egypt. Exodus 12:12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. This wasn't judgment aimed at the people of Egypt, but against the gods that they worshipped, in showing that they were in fact meaningless and inept to protect them. Moses had given people, including the Egyptians, ample notice of the coming judgment. There had now been 9 previous demonstrations of the power of God of the Hebrews and the lack of power held by the Egyptian gods. We have seen the sorcerers themselves state that God of the Hebrews was in fact God. And we have scriptural evidence that some of the Egyptians were now following Moses and not the Pharaoh. Then the plague of the death was administered upon the land of Egypt, and the judgment against the gods of Egypt was complete. Exodus 12:29. And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house that there was not one dead. So just to reiterate here, there was first a warning of his judgment before any plagues had been administered. Then there were 9 demonstrations of God's superior power against the gods of Egypt. There was a further warning of the judgment and a notification giving of how to avoid that coming judgment for anyone that had taken heed to the warning. Pharaoh, whose own firstborn had died, now officially lets the Hebrews go. Exodus 12:31. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord, as ye have said. And also take your flocks and your herds, as ye have said, and be gone, and bless me also. So now, after all that has happened, Pharaoh even asks for a blessing from Moses himself. The Hebrew people set off to leave Egypt. It must be noted that many Egyptians also left with the Hebrews, further highlighting the fact that Egyptians had followed Moses and more than likely avoided the plague of the death of the firstborns. And the children of Israel sojourned from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men beside children, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. God then acknowledges the fact that there were Egyptians in the group who were not children of Israel, and he instructs how they can be counted as Israel. Exodus 12:48. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you. So the Egyptians who joined with Israel were now able to be part of Israel. So God had not only accomplished freeing the Hebrew people through his actions, many Egyptians were also now free from the false gods of Egypt and were following the true God Yahweh. And thus God's plan for redemption of as many people as would hearken unto him was fulfilled. The slavery of the Hebrews and the murder of the Hebrew male babies was now over. Hopefully now there is a little more context to the accusation that God murdered innocent people, including children. The Egyptian people themselves were not innocent. Any statement to the contrary that God killed innocent people is based on a lack of knowledge of what the people of Egypt were engaged in, namely the enslavement and pogrom of the Hebrew male newborns. The children who died may well have been innocent. I want to point out that the children who died as a result of the 10th plague were not being punished by their deaths. The deaths of the children were as a consequence of sin, and their deaths were totally avoidable. God had given the Egyptian people and Pharaoh enough demonstrations of his might for everyone to have accepted him as a true God above their own and freed the Hebrew people from the bondage of slavery. God, unlike the Egyptian people, gave the Egyptians the time, the choice, and more importantly, the ability to evade this judgment. It can be asked why such a harsh judgment was against Egypt. Well, as we have clearly seen, God's words fell on deaf ears. And as after 9 demonstrations of power the Egyptians did not relinquish their hold over the Hebrews, this wasn't an act that God had wanted to inflict. It was his request that the Hebrews simply be allowed to leave. This was the choice that God had chosen. The request that Moses passed on to Pharaoh at the beginning. After 9 plagues, it was obvious that only an extreme act was going to suffice. Now, we have already answered the question, why didn't God simply kill Pharaoh instead of sending the plagues and ultimately killing the firstborns? And we have demonstrated that answer. It must be noted that reciprocal morality was part of Egyptian culture, the golden rule of reciprocity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This was a rule that the vast majority of ancient cultures lived by. Indeed, this principle was also part of the Hebrew culture. Pharaoh, as a moral governor, would have bound himself by this very moral code that the Egyptians themselves lived by, and would actually have expected, as the rule would state, to reap what he sowed. The Egyptian people would have also been too aware of this moral code, and would themselves not have been innocent of the Pharaoh's actions, having been given 9 chances beforehand to follow the God of the Hebrews. The judgment against the gods was not a punishment against the people of Egypt. There was no need for any of the plagues had Pharaoh simply responded to the initial request to let the Hebrews go. The Egyptian people had seen firsthand that God was indeed behind the plagues. The sorcerers of Pharaoh even had stated that it was in fact God himself who was causing the plagues. God, throughout the Bible, bestows the moral code that people live by back upon them to show the rights and wrongs of that moral code that they live by. What is good for the goose is good for the gander. You cannot expect to engage in 120-year plus enslavement of people and to kill newborn after newborn after newborn without any repercussions and some kind of moral judgment falling upon you at some point. In fact, I would ask anyone who wishes to use the killing of the firstborns of Egypt as a moral judgment against God, was God immoral to act and stop the Egyptians from engaging in their own immorality? Would it not be expected of God to have stopped the atrocities that brought about the very judgment that God administered? Would those very people who would say that God was immoral to act in the way that he did also say that had he not acted to save the Hebrew people and the slaughter of the newborns, then he would also have been immoral? And they would, by their own use of what is immoral, would also be forced to say that it would have been. And on that basis, either way, they would say that God was immoral. God enforces a people's own morality, which was not based on his own morality, back upon them. So the moral laws that the Egyptians had been living by were simply revisited back upon them. They had been oppressing the Hebrews, killing them throughout extreme forced labour and a pogrom of infanticide for some 120 years. So the deaths of the firstborns could simply be attributed to the consequences of this reciprocal morality, which, unlike the Egyptian enslavement and baby murders forced onto the Hebrew people, was completely avoidable. And as we have seen, although we have no way of telling how many, we can be certain that at least some Egyptians did in fact avoid this judgment. God stopped the Egyptians from the heinous crimes of wickedness that had brought about God's judgment, and did it in a way that would not only lead to the freedom of the Hebrew people, which as a result would end their oppression and their deaths of their children, but would also offer a way to the very Egyptians who were partaking in those crimes to be saved and freed as well. Very different to what the Egyptians had been engaging in. Now finally, it is left to see if it is possible to work out just how many children were actually killed during the last plague. When faced with the statement, all the firstborns, it is easy to conjure up images of the millions and millions of children throughout the world today, but that would be an inaccurate image. First off, this was limited to Egypt. The estimated population for this time was between 2 and 2.5 million people. The normal household would have had between 4 and 8 people, so we shall take 6 as being the average, 2 parents and 4 children. If we take the highest estimated population and divide it by 6, we get approximately 416,500 households. Secondly, the word firstborn here is the male word bekor, and it is masculine. It would appear that this was limited to only the male firstborns. This would eliminate approximately 50% of the households, as the firstborns would have been female. And so this brings us down to about 208,000. We also have to account for the very high mortality rate in the ancient world, especially amongst the firstborns. Estimations have this ranging from 30% right the way through to 75%. At the lowest range, this would be approximately 60,000, and at the highest range would be 150,000. So our total would be down to somewhere between 150,000 firstborns on the highest end and 60,000 on the low end. And it's also reasonable to assume that by firstborn, this would have excluded those who themselves had firstborns. Pharaoh, being Pharaoh, would more than likely have been the firstborn himself, but he didn't die. The average age of marriage for males would have been around 20 years old. So if a 20-year-old man who had not married and had not had a firstborn of his own, he would be the firstborn. As this was only firstborns and the average family would have had 4 children, it is likely that the firstborn would not have been a baby. It is likely that there would, in fact, be many who were in the range of adult and who would have been the firstborn. If we give this a very conservative rate of just 10% of the firstborns were in fact adults who had not yet married and had their own firstborn, then we've reduced these figures down to about 54,000 at the low end and 135,000 firstborns below the age of accountability when the plague came upon Egypt. Now, although these figures may yet seem high to some people, I'm sure they are much lower than most people's initial perception of how many children actually died. One figure we have no idea of, and therefore we cannot legitimately reduce the figure anymore by, is how many of these children were saved by their parents. Actions of following Moses and God. What we can safely say is that any of those children that did die, died because of the actions of their parents and their stubbornness, and their inactions of following Moses. We must also contrast this against the probable, literally hundreds of thousands and maybe even as much as millions of deaths of innocent Hebrew boys in the 120 years of the killing of newborn babies. Not to mention any of the Hebrew people who had been worked and possibly beaten to death while enslaved. God's intention was to prove he was God, and that the Egyptians' gods were useless, that people would come to him and accept him as God, and ultimately find salvation. The God who freed the Hebrews is the one true God. Through the actions of man, he sometimes has to resort to measures that he himself would rather not resort to as a means to an end. He suffered the Egyptians for a long time before intervening. When he did step in, he gave them every chance to repent before he acted, and even when he did act, he didn't do it before offering even the guilty a way of avoiding the actions, including the Pharaoh himself. So I hope this video has been useful and informative. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on another video. God bless.